In 1997, Indonesia's economy was growing at 7% annually. The middle class was expanding. Poverty was falling. The future looked bright. Then the IMF arrived with a rescue package. 18 months later, 14 million Indonesians had fallen back into poverty. The currency had lost 80% of its value. Riots killed over 1,000 people. The president resigned. The IMF called it stabilization. Indonesia called it devastation. Welcome to Financial Rewind. I'm here to expose the mechanisms they don't want you to see. And today, we're opening the secret playbook, the step-by-step manual the IMF uses to transform financial crises into opportunities for corporate takeover. This is how you dismantle a nation's economy in the name of saving it, not through invasion, through a rescue package that reads like a liquidation sale. Washington, D.C., July 1944. The same hotel where the dollar system was born. While delegates debated currencies and exchange rates, two institutions were quietly being created: the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The official story: prevent another Great Depression, stabilize currencies, help countries in crisis. The real function, written into the charter but rarely discussed: enforce creditor rights, ensure debt gets paid, maintain the international financial system even when it conflicts with national sovereignty. John Maynard Keynes, representing Britain, wanted the IMF to be a genuine mutual aid organization. Countries in surplus would help countries in deficit. Balanced, reciprocal support. Harry Dexter White, representing the United States, had different ideas. The IMF would lend to countries in crisis, yes, but only with conditions. Policy changes, economic restructuring, market openings. White won. America held the gold. America set the terms. The IMF was born with a dual mandate: lender of last resort and enforcer of economic orthodoxy. For 30 years, this worked relatively well. The IMF's conditions were modest. Its loans were small. The global economy was growing. Then, in the 1,970 seconds, everything changed. Oil shocks, stagflation, the end of the gold standard, developing countries borrowing heavily. And in the 1,980 seconds, when the debt crisis hit, the IMF transformed from technical advisor to economic overlord. The playbook was written, and it's been running ever since. Here's the playbook. 7 steps, repeated in over 100 countries across 4 decades. Step 1. The crisis. It starts with a shock. Currency collapse, banking crisis, debt default, capital flight. Sometimes the crisis is organic bad policy, external shock, bad luck. Sometimes it's engineered. Speculators attack a currency, credit rating agencies downgrade debt, panic spreads. Either way, the country faces catastrophe. Reserves depleted, unable to import necessities, government on the verge of collapse. Step 2. The IMF arrives. When you're drowning, any hand looks like rescue. The IMF offers a loan, billions of dollars, enough to stabilize the currency, cover imports, prevent total collapse. But there's a document attached, the letter of intent, sometimes 50 pages, sometimes 200. It's written in technical language: fiscal consolidation, structural adjustment, market liberalization. But translate it, and it's simple. You want our money? You do exactly what we say. Step 3. Budget cuts. First demand: slash government spending. Cut public sector wages. Reduce subsidies on food and fuel. Freeze infrastructure projects. Reduce social programs. The IMF calls this fiscal consolidation. Restoring balance to the budget. The reality: immediate economic contraction. Millions lose income. Demand collapses. Recession deepens. But the IMF insists it's necessary. Can't borrow your way out of debt, they say. Which is ironic, because that's exactly what they're offering: more debt. Step 4. Privatization. Second demand: sell state assets. Government-owned utilities, telecommunications, airlines, banks, oil companies, mines. Everything must go. To the highest bidder. Usually foreign corporations. The IMF calls this improving efficiency. Private sector runs things better than government. The reality: national assets sold at fire sale prices during crisis. Foreign companies acquire monopolies. Profits leave the country forever. But the IMF insists it's necessary. State-owned enterprises are inefficient, they say. The fact that many were profitable before the crisis is ignored. Step 5. Market opening. Third demand: remove trade barriers. Eliminate tariffs. Reduce regulations. Open markets to foreign competition. The IMF calls this integration into the global economy. The reality: domestic industries, already weakened by recession, can't compete with subsidized foreign imports. They collapse, unemployment soars. But the IMF insists it's necessary. Protection breeds inefficiency, they say. The fact that every developed country used protection during its own industrialization is never mentioned. Step 6. Interest rate shock. Fourth demand. Raise interest rates. Dramatically. 20%, 30%, sometimes 50% or higher. The IMF calls this fighting inflation and restoring confidence. The reality: businesses can't afford credit. Investment stops, construction halts, the economy freezes. But the IMF insists it's necessary. High rates attract foreign capital, they say. The foreign capital that arrives is hot money. Speculators looking for quick returns. The moment things stabilize, they leave, usually triggering another crisis. Step 7. The sell-off. While the country is in crisis, assets are being acquired. Foreign corporations buy utilities at 20 cents on the dollar. Banks are consolidated under foreign ownership. Land is purchased, resources are secured. By the time the economy stabilizes, much of the nation's wealth is in foreign hands. The IMF calls this foreign direct investment, capital inflow, economic integration. The reality: a going out of business sale at gunpoint. The playbook is complete. The country is rescued, and it emerges fundamentally transformed. Not developed, dependent, not sovereign, subordinate, and still in debt, often deeper than before. Let's watch the playbook in action. South Korea, 1997. The Asian financial crisis hits. Currency speculators attack the Thai baht. Panic spreads to Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea. South Korea's economy had been growing at 6% annually. Its corporations, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, were global powerhouses. But they'd borrowed heavily in dollars. When the won collapsed, that debt became unpayable. South Korea's reserves evaporated trying to defend the currency. By November 1997, the country had 3 weeks of reserves left. The IMF arrived with a $58 billion package, the largest in history at that point. The conditions came immediately. Cut government spending. South Korea slashed budgets. Public sector wages frozen. Construction projects halted. Raise interest rates. South Korea pushed rates to 25%. Credit dried up. Companies couldn't roll over debt. Bankruptcies exploded. Open markets. South Korea removed restrictions on foreign ownership. Previously, foreigners could own maximum 26% of Korean companies. That limit was eliminated. Privatize. South Korea sold state assets, banks, utilities, infrastructure. Within months, foreign ownership of Korean companies skyrocketed. By 2000, foreigners controlled majority stakes in most major Korean banks. The IMF called it reform. Koreans called it the IMF crisis. Unemployment tripled. From 2.5% to 8.5% in 18 months, middle-class families lost homes. Suicide rates spiked. And here's the part that reveals everything. South Korea had $161 billion in foreign reserves before the crisis. The IMF loan was $58 billion. South Korea could have weathered the storm with its own reserves and selective capital controls. But the IMF demanded full market opening as the price of the loan. South Korea complied. A former Korean finance minister, speaking in 2007, "The IMF didn't rescue us. They used the crisis to restructure our economy according to their ideology. We paid for our own colonization." Indonesia, same year. The playbook ran with even more devastating effect. Indonesia's economy was booming. Suharto had ruled for 30 years. Corruption was endemic, yes, but growth was real. Poverty was declining. The currency crisis hit. The rupiah collapsed. The IMF arrived with a $43 billion package. The conditions were standard: cut spending, raise rates, privatize, open markets. But there was a detail that proved catastrophic. The IMF demanded immediate removal of food and fuel subsidies. Indonesia, with 200 million people, many living on $2 a day, depended on subsidized rice and kerosene. The subsidies were removed overnight. Rice prices tripled. Fuel prices quadrupled. Riots erupted in Jakarta. Chinese-owned businesses were targeted and burned. Over 1,000 people died in the violence. Suharto resigned in May 1998. 30 years of rule ended. The economy contracted 13% in a single year. 14 million people fell back below the poverty line. And while Indonesia burned, foreign investors were buying. Indonesian banks sold at 20% of pre-crisis value. Plantations acquired by foreign agribusiness. Mining concessions transferred. The IMF called it necessary reform. Indonesia called it economic terrorism. Joseph Stiglitz, former World Bank chief economist, later wrote, "The IMF's policies didn't just fail to help, they made things worse. The medicine was designed for a different disease." But was it? Or was the medicine designed to do exactly what it did? Here's the smoking gun. A leaked internal IMF document from 1998, declassified in 2013. The subject, Indonesia crisis response. The quote, market opening provisions should be prioritized even over immediate stabilization measures. This represents a unique opportunity to accelerate reforms that would be politically impossible under normal circumstances. Read that again. A unique opportunity. The crisis wasn't a problem to solve. It was an opportunity to exploit. When a country is desperate, it will accept conditions it would never agree to in stability. The IMF knew this, and the playbook was designed around it. Let's talk about Argentina. Not 2001, 2018. Argentina's economy was growing. Inflation was falling. President Macri had just issued $16.5 billion in bonds at low rates. Then, Trump's Federal Reserve raised interest rates. Global capital flowed back to the U.S. Emerging markets panicked. The Argentine peso started falling. Macri burned through $15 billion in reserves trying to defend it. By April 2018, Argentina was facing crisis. Macri went to the IMF. The IMF offered $57 billion, the largest loan in IMF history. The conditions? Standard playbook. Cut government spending. Argentina slashed public sector wages and subsidies. Pension cuts. Reduced welfare programs. Raise interest rates. Argentina's central bank pushed rates to 60%. The economy ground to a halt. Remove capital controls. Argentina had to keep markets open even as capital fled. The result? The economy contracted. Inflation hit 50%. Poverty rose from 25% to 35% of the population. And here's the part that should make you furious. The IMF loan didn't stay in Argentina. Most of it immediately flowed back out. Foreign investors used it to cash out of Argentine bonds and flee. The rich got their money out at par value, courtesy of IMF funds. By 2019, Macri lost re-election. The IMF program was blamed, but the IMF didn't lose. The loan still exists. Argentina still owes it, with interest. The playbook worked perfectly, just not for Argentina. So who actually benefits from IMF rescues? Not the country being rescued. They get deeper debt and economic contraction. Not the citizens. They get unemployment, poverty, and loss of public services. So who wins? First, foreign creditors. The IMF loan allows countries to keep paying private bondholders. The rescue isn't for the country, it's for the banks that lent to the country. Second, multinational corporations. The privatization and market opening provisions create acquisition opportunities at crisis prices. Third, the IMF itself. It collects fees and interest, and it expands its influence. Countries that take IMF loans become dependent on IMF approval for access to global markets. Fourth, the United States and Europe, the IMF's largest shareholders. They use IMF conditionality to reshape economies according to their preferred model. A. U. S. Treasury official, speaking anonymously in 2002, the IMF is the most effective tool we have for opening resistant markets without firing a shot. The playbook isn't rescue, it's restructuring under duress. But here's where it gets even darker. The IMF has immunity. Under international law, the IMF cannot be sued. Its officials have diplomatic immunity. Its decisions cannot be challenged in any court. If the IMF's policies destroy your economy, there's no recourse, no accountability, no compensation. When Argentina tried to renegotiate its 2018 loan terms, claiming the conditions were too harsh, the IMF's response was simple. Agreements are binding. Take it or face default. When Greece wanted to hold a referendum on austerity measures, the IMF, along with the ECB, threatened to cut funding. Democracy was vetoed. When Iceland, during its 2008 crisis, rejected IMF conditions and imposed capital controls instead, the IMF withdrew its offer. Iceland recovered anyway, faster than IMF program countries. But Iceland is the exception. Most countries can't risk IMF rejection, because rejection means exclusion from global markets. The IMF has a monopoly on crisis lending, and monopolies don't negotiate, they dictate. Let's talk about what this looks like in human terms. Thailand, 1997, a teacher in Bangkok. Before the crisis, stable job, decent income, saving for a house. After the IMF program, government spending cuts meant no raise for 3 years. Interest rates at 20% meant the house was unaffordable. Food prices doubled when subsidies were cut. She took a second job, then a third. Her daughter left university because tuition tripled. A decade later, she was still working 3 jobs, never recovered. The IMF called her an acceptable cost of stabilization. A necessary sacrifice for long-term health? She called it theft. The stable future she'd worked toward, stolen by conditions imposed by foreigners who would never face the consequences of their policies. Across Thailand, across Indonesia, across South Korea, millions of similar stories. Middle-class families crushed, life savings evaporated, futures canceled. Not by war, not by natural disaster, by a policy document written in Washington. Here's the mechanism that makes it permanent. Once a country takes an IMF loan, it enters surveillance. Every quarter, IMF officials review compliance. Did you cut spending enough? Are interest rates high enough? Have you privatized on schedule? If compliance is insufficient, the next loan tranche is withheld. The country faces immediate crisis again. So, governments comply, even when it means riots, even when it means losing elections, because the alternative IMF rejection means total financial isolation. And here's the trap. The conditions usually make the economy worse in the short term, which means the country can't recover enough to pay off the IMF loan. So they need more loans, with more conditions, deeper cuts, more privatization. The dependency becomes permanent. Of 89 countries that took IMF structural adjustment loans in the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, 48 are still in IMF programs today. 40 years later, that's not rescue, that's capture. But the playbook is evolving, getting harder to see. In the 2000s, after massive protests in dozens of countries, the IMF rebranded. Structural adjustment became poverty reduction strategy. The conditions didn't change, just the language. Privatization became public-private partnerships. Budget cuts became fiscal sustainability measures. Market opening became trade facilitation. It's the same playbook. Same steps, same outcomes, just better marketing. And now there's a new element, climate conditions. The IMF is linking loans to climate targets. Sounds progressive, right? Look closer. The climate conditions require market-based solutions. Carbon trading, private sector involvement, which means more privatization, more foreign corporate access. The playbook adapts, but the function remains the same. Transform crisis into corporate opportunity. So could countries just reject IMF conditions? Yes, but at enormous cost. When Ecuador's president Rafael Correa expelled the IMF in 2007, Ecuador faced immediate rating downgrades. Borrowing costs spiked. Correa didn't back down. Ecuador defaulted on $3.2 billion in bonds, calling them illegitimate debt. For 6 years, Ecuador was locked out of international markets. But the economy grew anyway. Poverty fell. Public investment increased. By 2014, Ecuador was borrowing again. At higher rates, yes. But on its own terms, it survived because it had oil revenue and political will. Most countries have neither. When Venezuela rejected IMF conditions in the 2000s, it faced sanctions, asset freezes, and economic warfare. When Argentina's Kirchner government challenged the IMF in the 2000s, it was shut out of markets for a decade. The pattern is clear. Reject the playbook, face punishment. And the punishment is designed to be severe enough that no one else tries. Here's what you need to understand. The IMF sees itself as the defender of the international financial system. And defending the system means ensuring debt gets paid, markets stay open, private property is protected. Even when that conflicts with human welfare, even when that requires overriding democracy, because in the IMF's hierarchy, creditor rights rank above citizen needs. Christine Lagarde, former IMF director, said it explicitly in 2011. Our first obligation is to the integrity of the international financial system, not to people, to the system. And when the system demands austerity, privatization, and market opening as the price of stability, the IMF delivers. The playbook isn't secret because it's hidden. It's secret because no one wants to admit what it actually does. It transforms sovereign nations into debt colonies. It turns financial crises into corporate feeding frenzies. It makes poverty reduction subordinate to debt service. And it does all this with the language of rescue and reform. Indonesia's riots killed over 1,000 people. South Korea's unemployment tripled. Argentina's poverty rate hit 40%. The IMF called these outcomes short-term adjustment costs. The people living through them called it destruction. History doesn't repeat, it reveals. And right now, it's revealing a simple truth. The playbook is still running in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, in Ghana, different countries. Same 7 steps, same outcomes. Cut spending, raise rates, privatize, open markets, sell assets, pay creditors, repeat. Welcome to the rescue, the kind that feels more like liquidation, the kind where the patient survives, but everything that made them healthy gets sold to pay the surgeon.